Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for January 4th, 2023. Today we're going to take a look at the whole question that the British are still running the war operations. Many of you are somewhat skeptical about that. You talk about the British Empire as a thing of the past. I'm not trying to give a free pass to the United States because we see the long-term influence of the British through such U.S. political and institutional figures as Henry Kissinger, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who essentially functioned as operatives of the British system inside the American government. But there's a new evidence that's emerged, and just over the weekend from January 1st, an op-ed in the New York Times, which demonstrates conclusively the role that the British are playing in shaping the talking points that are coming from the U.S. foreign policy establishment, and of course the defense and military establishment. This is an op-ed titled "Putin Has No Red Lines," written by Nigel Gould-Davies. Now, he's a senior fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, the IISS, which is one of the leading think tanks in London, which has been at the center of the Cold War and the post-Cold War shaping of the narratives coming from London and adopted by American co-thinkers. The core mission of this think tank, according to its own website, is, quote, to help the world understand and address global security challenges, unquote. In other words, to impose the policies which benefit the City of London, and to have conferences, seminars, webcasts, and so on that promote these ideas. And the op-ed in the New York Times is one of these. Now, Gould-Davies has a background at Oxford and Harvard. He worked in the British Foreign Service, both in the embassy in Moscow and then as ambassador to Belarus. In the op-ed, what he says is that the West must drop its resistance to all-out assistance to Ukraine in the war and to move to an all-out confrontation against Moscow without fear of a Russian retaliation, that fear in the form of a red line is holding back the possibility of a victory for NATO in Ukraine. What he said is this should include sending all advanced weapon systems to Ukraine. Ignore Moscow's red lines. He said the red lines are supposedly interest defined as necessary for national security. But he said that if the idea of Russia is that, or if the idea is that Russia can dictate what NATO policy should be, this undermines the ability to carry out the goal, which is to defeat Russia as a defined enemy of the British or the Anglo-American system. Now, this is where it gets interesting. He cites as his authority for this concept none other than the leading imperial protagonist, Lord Palmerston, from the mid-19th century. Palmerston is famous for a number of things, including his coordination of the Opium Wars against China, when the British fleet was sent to China twice to force or to defeat the resistance in China to the importation of Indian opium as a way of carrying out a trade disadvantage for London. He also was behind the crushing of the Indian Rebellion in 1857 and 58, and he was an advocate of support for the Confederacy in the United States as a way of breaking apart the Union. Now, what he argues is that the goal must be to reject the fear that one country's actions will drive an adversary to react. Instead, he said, the policy must be, quote, to induce an adversary to accept its goals. Now, this is the kind of soft brainwashing which we're seeing more and more discussion of, psychological warfare as a leading element of geopolitics. Now, you often hear people talk about geopolitics as though it's an actual science or something of that sort. So the question we're going to look at now is, what is the origin of this concept of geopolitics? And how does it fit in with information warfare or hybrid warfare? Because there's a growing discussion of replacing what they call fact-checking or debunking with the concept of pre-bunking, which is to make sure that certain ideas are not even considered in a dialogue or a discussion. And that's what Gould-Davies' editorial is part of an effort to do, to pre-bunk the idea that there's any legitimacy whatsoever from Russia in its special military operation in Ukraine. It's useful that he refers to Palmerston as the defining influence, because the goal of the British Empire from the time of the American Revolution, that is the anti-colonial revolt that succeeded, until 1865, the goal of the British was to destroy the United States, to weaken it through war, through economic warfare. Their fear was that the adoption of the American system of physical economy, taking the power away from private bankers and putting it in the hands of a government committed to the benefit and welfare of its population, that if this idea caught on, it would put an end to the British Empire, and therefore that was the enemy, the American system. But they failed. They failed in the Revolutionary War, they failed in 1812, and they failed in the Civil War. And so they made a shift to the effort to re-assimilate the United States into the British Empire as a partner. The idea of using American brawn to enforce the policies that benefit the City of London. Now, this included setting up such things as the Rhodes Scholarship Fund, eventually the Chatham House, creating the Council on Foreign Relations in the United States, the role of the Atlantic Council after 1961, to use these institutions and think tanks as talking centers to force American policymakers to adopt British strategic interests. Now, the emphasis shifted after the Civil War to the United States as a partner, but a partner to do what? To destroy Germany and Russia. Germany and Russia became the key enemies. Now, Russia had already been in the British target zone with the so-called Great Game in the middle of the 19th century, the Crimean War, and so on. But Germany, after Bismarck's adoption of American system economic reforms in the late 1870s, propelled Germany as an industrial power and a threat to British interests, such things as the Trans-Siberian Railroad with German involvement, the Berlin to Baghdad Railroad, and so on. These were seen as existential threats. And so the idea of geopolitics was to adopt a set of, or an outlook, which defined these as enemies to the British Empire, but to convince the Americans that this also threatened the United States. Now, this led to 2 world wars in the 20th century. In each case, the goal was to have Russia and Germany destroy each other. The present use of NATO in Ukraine against Russia is a continuation of this policy. The idea of global NATO to contain China is another example of geopolitics. But keep in mind, this partnership of the United States with the British Empire was never meant for the benefit of the American people, but only for the Anglophile American oligarchy and their interests. Just as the alliance with Germany today under control of NATO, under domination, psychological domination of NATO, has no benefit for Germany. War is the instrument of policy for them, but at the same time, information war, or hybrid warfare as it's called, is a tool of manipulation of a population to give them an enemy image, to push the nation to war as opposed to addressing the problems with the institutions themselves. Now, counter to this was the adoption, or the drafting, I should say, of Helga Zepp-LaRouche's fundamental principles, which would provide a basis for peace. One of these is end geopolitics. Now, we see something in this direction occurring today, as I reported yesterday with the Turkish-Syrian negotiations. Another development today is the trip of the Philippine President Fernando Marcos Jr. to Beijing for 2 days of talks, the adoption of memos of understanding on trade and investment, security relations to get away from a conflict in the South China Seas. Marcos Jr. said that opportunities exist, quote, for peace and development to the peoples of both our countries. That is mutual benefit, cooperation, a win-win idea, as opposed to division characterized by geopolitics. Now, to give people more background on this, I'm going to put a link today at the bottom of the description page to an incredibly insightful article written by Lyndon LaRouche in 1999 titled The Myth of Geopolitics. I'd urge you to read it. If you have some thoughts on it, send me your thoughts. You can send them to me at harleysch@gmail.com or post them underneath the YouTube or Facebook posting of this update today. And share it. Share the update. Discuss it. We have to win people to an understanding that there's no gain to the United States sticking within the narratives of geopolitics, and everything to gain by breaking from that into an era of peaceful security based on economic cooperation for mutual benefit. So thanks for joining me. I hope you'll read this article, and I'll be back with you tomorrow.